Chapter 21 Kiev. Owing to the many difficulties and delays, the journey from Fastov to Kiev lasted 6 days and was a continuous nightmare. The railway situation was appalling. At every station, scores of freight cars clogged the lines, nor were they loaded with provisions to feed the starving cities. They were densely packed with human cargo, among whom the sick were a large percentage. All along the route, the waiting rooms and platforms were filled with crowds, bedraggled and dirty. Even more ghastly were the scenes at night. Everywhere, masses of desperate people shouting and struggling to gain a foothold on the train. They resembled the damned of Dante's Inferno, their faces ashen grey in the dim light, all frantically fighting for a place. Now and then, an agonised cry would ring through the night, and the already moving train would come to a halt. Somebody had been thrown to his death under the wheels. It was a relief to reach Kiev. We had expected to find the city almost in ruins, but we were pleasantly disappointed. When we left Petrograd, the Soviet press contained numerous stories of vandalism committed by Poles before evacuating Kiev. They had almost demolished the famous ancient cathedral in the city, the papers wrote, destroyed the waterworks and electric stations, and set fire to several parts of the city. Chicherin and Lunacharsky issued passionate appeals to the cultured people of the world in protest against such barbarism. The crime of the Poles against art was compared to that committed by the Germans in Rams, whose celebrated cathedral had been injured by Prussian artillery. We were therefore much surprised to find Kiev in even better condition than Petrograd. In fact, the city had suffered very little, considering the numerous changes of government and the accompanying military operations. It is true that some bridges and railroad tracks had been blown up on the outskirts of the city, but Kiev itself was almost unharmed. People looked at us in amazement when we made inquiries about the condition of the cathedral. They had not heard the Moscow report. Unlike our welcome in Kharkiv and Poltava, Kiev proved a disappointment. The secretary of Ispolkom was not very amiable and appeared not at all impressed by Zinoviev's signature on our credentials. Our secretary succeeded in seeing the chairman of the executive committee, but returned very discouraged. That high official was too impatient to listen to her representations. He was busy, he said, and could not be troubled. It was decided that I try my luck as an American, with the result that the chairman finally agreed to give us access to the available material. It was a sad reflection on the irony of life. America was in league with world imperialism to starve and crush Russia, yet it was sufficient to mention that one came from America to find the key to everything in Russia. It was pathetic and rather distasteful to make use of that key. In Kiev, antagonism to communism was intense, even the local Bolsheviki being bitter against Moscow. It was out of the question for anyone coming from the centre to secure their cooperation, unless armed with state powers. The government employees in Soviet institutions took no interest in anything save their rations. Bureaucratic indifference and incompetence in Ukraine were even worse than in Moscow, and were augmented by nationalistic resentment against the Russians. It was true also of Kharkiv and Poltava, though in a lesser degree. Here, the very atmosphere was charged with distrust and hatred of everything Muscovite. The deception practiced on us by the chairman of the educational department of Kharkiv was characteristic of the resentment almost every Ukrainian official felt towards Moscow. The chairman was a Ukrainian to the core, but he could not openly ignore our credentials signed by Zinoviev and Lunacharsky. He promised to aid our efforts, but he disliked the idea of Petrograd absorbing the historical material of the Ukraine. In Kiev, there was no attempt to mask the opposition to Moscow. One was made to feel it everywhere. But the moment the magic word America was spoken, and the people made to understand that one was not a communist, they became interested and courteous, even confidential. The Ukrainian communists were also no exception. The information and documents collected in Kiev were of the same character as the data gathered in the former cities. The system of education, care of the sick, distribution of labour, and so forth were similar to the general Bolshevik scheme. We follow the Moscow plan, said a Ukrainian teacher, with the only difference that in our schools the Ukrainian language is taught together with Russian. The people, and especially the children, looked better fed and clad than those of Russia proper. Food was comparatively more plentiful and cheaper. There were show schools, as in Petrograd and Moscow, and no one apparently realized the corrupting effect of such discrimination upon the teachers as well as the children. The latter looked with envy upon the pupils of the favoured schools and believed that they were only for communist children, which in reality was not the case. The teachers, on the other hand, knowing how little attention was paid to ordinary schools, were negligent in their work. All tried to get a position in the show schools, which were enjoying special and varied rations. The chairman of the Board of Health was an alert and competent man, one of the few officials in Kiev who showed interest in the expedition and its work. He devoted much time to explaining to us the methods of his organisation and pointing out interesting places to visit and the material which could be collected for the museum. He especially called our attention to the Jewish hospital for crippled children. I found the latter in the charge of a cultivated and charming man, Dr. N. For 20 years he had been head of the hospital, and he took interest as well as pride in showing us about his institution and relating its history. The hospital had formerly been one of the most famous in Russia, the pride of the local Jews, who had built and maintained it, but within recent years its usefulness had become curtailed owing to the frequent changes of government. It had been exposed to persecution and repeated pogroms. Jewish patients, critically ill, were often forced out of their beds to make room for the favourites of this or that regime. The officers of the Denikin army were most brutal. They drove the Jewish patients out into the street, subjected them to indignities and abuse, and would have killed them had it not been for the intercession of the hospital staff, who, at the risk of their own lives, protected the sick. It was only the fact that the majority of the staff were Gentiles that saved the hospital and its inmates, but the shock resulted in numerous deaths, and many patients were left with shattered nerves. The doctor also related to me the story of some of the patients, most of them the victims of the Fastov pogroms. Among them were children between the ages of 6 and 8, gaunt and sickly looking, terror stamped on their faces. They had lost all their kin. In some cases, the whole family had been killed before their eyes. These children often waked at night, the physician said, in fright at their horrible dreams. Everything possible was being done for them, but so far, the unfortunate children had not been freed from the memory of their terrible experiences at Fastov. The doctor pointed out a group of young girls between the ages of 14 and 18, the worst victims of the Denikin pogrom. All of them had been repeatedly outraged and were in a mutilated state when they came to the hospital. It would take years to restore them to health. The doctor emphasized the fact that no pogroms had taken place during the Bolshevik regime. It was a great relief to him and his staff to know that his patients were no longer in such danger. But the hospital had other difficulties. There was the constant interference by political commissars and the daily struggle for supplies. I spend most of my time in various bureaus, he said, instead of devoting myself to my patients. Ignorant officials are given power over the medical profession, continuously harassing the doctors in their work. The doctor himself had been repeatedly arrested for sabotage because of his inability to comply with the numerous decrees and orders, frequently mutually contradictory. It was the result of a system in which political usefulness, rather than professional merit, played the main role. It often happened that a first-class physician of well-known repute and long experience would be suddenly ordered to some distant part to place a communist doctor in his position. Under such conditions, the best efforts were being paralysed. Moreover, there was a general suspicion of the intelligentsia, which was a demoralising factor. It was true that many of that class had sabotaged, but there were also those who did heroic and self-sacrificing work. The Bolsheviki, by their indiscriminate antagonism towards the intelligentsia as a class, roused prejudices and passions which poisoned the mainsprings of cultural life in the country. The Russian intelligentsia had with its very blood fertilized the soil of the revolution, yet it was not given it to reap the fruits of its long struggle. A tragic fate, the doctor remarked. Unless one forget it in his work, existence would be impossible. The institution for crippled children proved a very model and modern hospital, located in the heart of a very large park. It was devoted to the marred creatures with twisted limbs and deformed bodies, victims of the Great War, disease and famine. The children looked aged and withered. Like Father Time, they had been born old. They lay in rows on clean white beds, baking in the warm sun of the Ukrainian summer. The head physician, who guided us through the institution, seemed much beloved by his little charges. They were eager and pleased to see him, as he approached each helpless child and bent over affectionately to make some inquiries about its health. The hospital had been in existence for many years, and was considered the first of its kind in Russia. Its equipment for the care of deformed and crippled children was among the most modern. Since the war and the revolution, we feel rather behind the times, the doctor said. We have been cut off from the civilized world for so many years, but in spite of the various government changes, we have striven to keep up our standards and to help the unfortunate victims of strife and disease. The supplies for the institution were provided by the government, and the hospital force was exposed to no interference, though I understood from the doctor that because of his political neutrality, he was looked upon by the Bolsheviki as inclined to counter-revolution. The hospital contained a large number of children. Some of those who could walk about studied music and art, and we had the opportunity of attending an informal concert arranged by the children and their teachers in our honour. Some of them played the balalaka in a most artistic manner, and it was consoling to see those marred children finding forgetfulness in the rhythm of the folk melodies of the Ukraina. Early during our stay in Kiev, we learned that the most valuable material for the museum was not to be found in the Soviet institutions, but that it was in the possession of other political groups and private persons. The best statistical information on pogroms, for instance, was in the hands of a former minister of the Rada regime in the Ukraina. I succeeded in locating the man, and great was my surprise when, upon learning my identity, he presented me with several copies of the Mother Earth magazine I had published in America. The ex-minister arranged a small gathering, to which were invited some writers and poets, and men active in the Jewish Culture Liga, to meet several members of our expedition. The gathering consisted of the best elements of the local Jewish intelligentsia. We discussed the revolution, the Bolshevik methods, and the Jewish problem. Most of those present, though opposed to the communist theories, were in favour of the Soviet government. They felt that the Bolsheviki, in spite of their many blunders, were striving to further the interests of Russia and the revolution. At any rate, under the communist regime, the Jews were not exposed to the pogroms practiced upon them by all the other regimes of the Ukraina. Those Jewish intellectuals argued that the Bolsheviki at least permitted the Jews to live, and that they were therefore to be preferred to any other governments, and they should be supported by the Jews. They were fearful of the growth of anti-Semitism in Russia, and were horrified at the possibility of the Bolsheviki being overthrown. Wholesale slaughter of the Jews would undoubtedly follow, they believed. Some of the younger set held a different view. The Bolshevik regime had resulted in increased hatred towards the Jews, they said, for the masses were under the impression that most of the communists were Jews. Communism stood for forcible tax collection, punitive expeditions, and the Cheka. Popular opposition to the communists therefore expressed itself in the hatred of the whole Jewish race. Thus, Bolshevik tyranny had added fuel to the latent anti-Semitism of the Ukraina. Moreover, to prove that they were not discriminating in favour of the Jews, the Bolsheviki had gone to the other extreme and frequently arrested and punished Jews for things that the Gentiles could do with impunity. The Bolsheviki also fostered and endowed cultural work in the South in the Ukrainian language, while at the same time they discouraged such efforts in the Jewish language. It was true that the Culture Liga was still permitted to exist, but its work was hampered at every step. In short, the Bolsheviki permitted the Jews to live, but only in a physical sense. Culturally, they were condemned to death. The Yevkom, Jewish Communist section, was receiving, of course, every advantage and support from the government, but then its mission was to carry the gospel of the proletarian dictatorship to the Jews of the Ukraina. It was significant that the Yevkom was more anti-Semitic than the Ukrainians themselves. If it had the power, it would pogrom every non-communist Jewish organization and destroy all Jewish educational efforts. This young element emphasized that they did not favor the overthrow of the Bolshevik government, but they could not support it either. I felt that both Jewish factions took a purely nationalistic view of the Russian situation. I could well understand their personal attitude, the result of their own suffering and the persecution of the Jewish race. Still, my chief concern was the revolution and its effects upon Russia as a whole. Whether the Bolsheviki should be supported or not could not depend merely on their attitude to the Jews and the Jewish question. The latter was surely a very vital and pressing issue, especially in the Ukraina, yet the general problem involved was much greater. It embraced the complete economic and social emancipation of the whole people of Russia, the Jews included. If the Bolshevik methods and practices were not imposed upon them by force of circumstances, if they were conditioned in their own theories and principles, and if their sole object was to secure their own power, I could not support them. They might be innocent of pogroms against the Jews, but if they were pogroming the whole of Russia, then they had failed in their mission as a revolutionary party. I was not prepared to say if I had reached a clear understanding of all the problems involved, but my experience so far led me to think that it was the basic Bolshevik conception of the revolution which was false, its practical application necessarily resulting in the Great Russian Catastrophe, of which the Jewish tragedy was but a minor part. My host and his friends could not agree with my viewpoint. We represented opposite camps. But the gathering was nevertheless intensely interesting, and it was arranged that we meet again before our departure from the city. Returning to our car one day, I saw a detachment of Red Army soldiers at the railway station. On inquiry, I found that foreign delegates were expected from Moscow, and the soldiers had been ordered out to participate in a demonstration in their honour. Groups of uniformed men stood about discussing the arrival of the mission. There were many expressions of dissatisfaction because the soldiers had been kept waiting so long. "These people come to Russia just to look us over," one of the Red Army men said. "Do they know anything about us? Or are they interested in how we live? Not they. It's a holiday for them. They are dressed up and fed by the government, but they never talk to us, and all they see is how we march past. Here we have been lying around in the burning sun for hours, while the delegates are probably being feasted at some other station. That's comradeship and equality for you." I had heard such sentiments voiced before, but it was surprising to hear them from soldiers. I thought of Angelica Balbanova, who was accompanying the Italian mission, and I wondered what she would think if she knew how the men felt. It had probably never occurred to her that those ignorant Russian peasants in military uniform had looked through the sham of official demonstrations. The following day, we received an invitation from Balbanova to attend a banquet given in honour of the Italian delegates. Anxious to meet the foreign guests, several members of our expedition accepted the invitation. The affair took place in the former Chamber of Commerce building, profusely decorated for the occasion. In the main banquet hall, long tables were heavily laden with fresh-cut flowers, several varieties of southern fruit and wine. The sight reminded me of the feasts of the old bourgeoisie, and I could see that Angelica felt rather uncomfortable at the lavish display of silverware and wealth. The banquet opened with the usual toasts, the guests drinking to Lenin, Trotsky, the Red Army, and the Third International, the whole company rising as the revolutionary anthem was intoned after each toast, with the soldiers and officers standing at attention in good old military style. Among the delegates were two young French anarcho-syndicalists. They had heard of our presence in Kiev and had been looking for us all day without being able to locate us. After the banquet, they were immediately to leave for Petrograd, so that we had only a short time at our disposal. On our way to the station, the delegates related that they had collected much material on the revolution which they had intended to publish in France. They had become convinced that all was not well with the Bolshevik regime. They had come to realize that the dictatorship of the proletariat was in the exclusive hands of the Communist Party, while the common worker was enslaved as much as ever. It was their intention, they said, to speak frankly about these matters to their comrades at home, and to substantiate their attitude by the material in their possession. "Do you expect to get the documents out?" I asked Le Petit, one of the delegates. "You don't mean that I might be prevented from taking my own notes," he replied. "The Bolsheviki would not dare to go so far, not with foreign delegates at any rate." He seemed so confident that I did not care to pursue the subject any further. That night, the delegates left Kiev, and a short time afterward they departed from Russia. They were never seen alive again. Without making any comment upon their disappearance, I merely want to mention that when I returned to Moscow several months later, it was generally related that the two anarcho-syndicalists, with several other men who had accompanied them, were overtaken by a storm somewhere off the coast of Finland, and were all drowned. There were rumours of foul play, though I'm not inclined to credit the story, especially in the view of the fact that together with the anarcho-syndicalists also perished a communist in good standing in Moscow. But their disappearance, with all the documents they had collected, has never been satisfactorily explained. The rooms assigned to the members of our expedition were located in a house within a passage leading off the Kreshchatyk, the main street of Kiev. It had formerly been the wealthy residential section of the city, and its fine houses, though lately neglected, still looked imposing. The passage also contained a number of shops, ruins of former glory, which catered to the well-to-do neighbourhood. Those stores still had good supplies of vegetables, fruit, milk and butter. They were owned mostly by old Jews whose energies could not be applied to any other usefulness, Orthodox Jews to whom the revolution and the Bolsheviki were a bête noire, because they had ruined all business. The little shops barely enabled their owners to exist. Moreover, they were in constant danger of Cheka raids, on which occasions the provisions would be expropriated. The appearance of those stories did not justify the belief that the government would find it worthwhile raiding them. Would not the Cheka prefer to confiscate the goods of the big delicatessen and fruit stores on the Kreshchatyk? I asked an old Jewish storekeeper. Not at all, he replied. Those stores are immune because they pay heavy taxes. The morning following the banquet, I went down to the little grocery store I used to do my shopping in. The place was closed, and I was surprised to find that not one of the small shops nearby was open. 2 days later, I learned that the places had all been raided on the eve of the banquet in order to feast the foreign delegates. I promised myself never to attend another Bolshevik banquet. Among the members of the Cultural Liga, I met a man who had lived in America, but for several years now was with his family in Kiev. His home proved to be one of the most hospitable during my stay in the South, and he had many callers belonging to various social classes. I was able to gather much information about the recent history of the Ukraine. My host was not a communist. Though critical of the Bolshevik regime, he was by no means antagonistic. He used to say that the main fault of the Bolsheviki was their lack of psychological perception. He asserted that no government had ever such a great opportunity in the Ukraine as the communists. The people had suffered so much from the various occupations and were so oppressed by every new regime that they rejoiced when the Bolsheviki entered Kiev. Everybody hoped that they would bring relief, but the communists quickly destroyed all illusions. Within a few months, they proved themselves entirely incapable of administering the affairs of the city. Their methods antagonized the people, and the terrorism of the Cheka turned even the friends of the communists to bitter enmity. Nobody objected to the nationalization of industry, and it was of course expected that the Bolsheviki would expropriate. But when the bourgeoisie had been relieved of its possessions, it was found that only the raiders benefited. Neither the people at large, nor even the proletarian class gained anything. Precious jewellery, silverware, furs, practically the whole wealth of Kiev seemed to disappear and was no more heard of. Later, members of the Cheka strutted about the streets with their women gowned in the finery of the bourgeoisie. When private business places were closed, the doors were locked and sealed and guards placed there, but within a few weeks the stores were found empty. This kind of management and the numerous slew laws and edicts, often mutually conflicting, served the Cheka as a pretext to terrorize and mulct the citizens and aroused general hatred against the Bolsheviki. The people had turned against Petlura, Denikin, and the Poles. They welcomed the Bolsheviki with open arms, but the last disappointed them as the first. Now we have gotten used to the situation, my host said. We just drift and manage as best we can. But he thought it a pity that the Bolsheviki lost such a great chance. They were unable to hold the confidence of the people and to direct the confidence into constructive channels. Not only had the Bolsheviki failed to operate the big industries, they also destroyed the small Kostarnya work. There had been thousands of artisans in the province of Kiev, for instance. Most of them had worked by themselves, without exploiting anyone. They were independent producers who supplied a certain need to the community. The Bolsheviki, in their reckless scheme of nationalization, suspended those efforts without being able to replace them with aught else. They had nothing to give, either to the workers or to the peasants. The city proletariat faced the alternative of starving in the city or going back to the country. They preferred the latter, of course. Those who could not get to the country engaged in trade, buying and selling jewellery, for instance. Practically everybody in Russia had become a tradesman, the Bolshevik government no less than private speculators. You have no idea of the cement of illicit business carried on by officials in Soviet institutions, my host informed me, nor is the army free from it. My nephew, a Red Army officer, a communist, has just returned from the Polish front. He can tell you about these practices in the army. I was particularly eager to talk to the young officer. In my travels, I had met many soldiers, and I found that most of them had retained the old slave psychology and bowed absolutely to military discipline. Some, however, were very wide awake and could see clearly what was happening about them. A certain small element in the Red Army was entirely transformed by the revolution. It was proof of the gestation of new life and new forms, which set Russia apart from the rest of the world, notwithstanding Bolshevik tyranny and oppression. For that element, the revolution had a deep significance. They saw it as something vital, which even the daily decrees could not compress within the narrow communist mold. It was their attitude and general sentiment that the Bolsheviki had not kept faith with the people. They saw the communist state growing at the cost of the revolution, and some of them even went so far as to voice the opinion that the Bolsheviki had become the enemies of the revolution. But they all felt that for the time being they could do nothing. They were determined to dispose of the foreign enemies first. Then, they would say, we will face the enemy at home. The Red Army officer proved a fine-looking fellow, very deeply in earnest. At first, he was disinclined to talk, but in the course of the evening he grew less embarrassed and expressed his feelings freely. He had found much corruption at the front, he said, but it was even worse at the base of supplies, where he had done duty for some time. The men at the front were practically without clothes or shoes. The food was insufficient, and the army was ravaged by typhoid and cholera. Yet, the spirit of the men was wonderful. They fought bravely, enthusiastically, because they believed in their ideal of a free Russia. But while they were fighting and dying for the great cause, the higher officers, the so-called Tovarishchi, sat in safe retreat, and there drank and gambled and got rich by speculation. The supplies so desperately needed at the front were being sold at fabulous prices to speculators. The young officer had become so disheartened by the situation he had thought of committing suicide. But now he was determined to return to the front. "I shall go back and tell my comrades what I have seen," he said. "Our real work will begin when we have defeated the foreign invasion. Then we shall go after those who are trading away the revolution." I felt there was no cause to despair, so long as Russia possessed such spirits. I returned to my room to find our secretary waiting to report the valuable find she had made. It consisted of rich Denikin material, stacked in the city library and apparently forgotten by everybody. The librarian, a zealous Ukrainian nationalist, refused to permit the Russian museum to take the material, though it was of no use to Kiev, literally buried in an obscure corner and exposed to danger and ruin. We decided to appeal to the Department of Education and to apply the American amulet. It grew to be a standing joke among the members of the expedition to resort to the amulet in difficult situations. Such matters were always referred to Alexander Berkman and myself as the Americans. It required considerable persuasion to interest the chairman in the matter. He persisted in refusing till I finally asked him, "Are you willing that it become known in America that you prefer to have valuable historical material rot away in Kiev rather than give it to the Petrograd Museum, which is sure to become the world center for the study of the Russian Revolution, and where Ukraine is to have such an important part?" At last, the chairman issued the required order, and our expedition took possession of the material to the great elation of our secretary, to whom the museum represented the most important interest in life. In the afternoon of the same day, I was visited by a woman anarchist who was accompanied by a young peasant girl, confidentially introduced as the wife of Makhno. My heart stood still for a moment. The presence of that girl in Kiev meant certain death were she discovered by the Bolsheviki. It also involved grave danger to my landlord and his family, for in communist Russia, harbouring, even unwittingly, a member of the Makhno Povstancy often incurred the worst consequences. I expressed surprise at the young woman's recklessness in thus walking into the very jaws of the enemy, but she explained that Makhno was determined to reach us. He would not trust anyone else with the message, and therefore she had volunteered to come. It was evident that danger had lost all terror for her. "We have been living in constant peril for years," she said simply. Divested of her disguise, she revealed much beauty. She was a woman of 25, with a wealth of jet black hair of striking luster. "Nestor had hoped that you and Alexander Berkman would manage to come, but he waited in vain," she began. "Now, he sent me to tell you about the struggle he is waging, and hopes that you will make his purpose known to the world outside." Late into the night, she related the story of Makhno, which tallied in all important features with that told to us by the 2 Ukrainian visitors in Petrograd. She dwelt on the methods employed by the Bolsheviki to eliminate Makhno, and the agreements they had repeatedly made with him, every one of which had been broken by the communists the moment immediate danger of invaders was over. She spoke of the savage persecution of the members of the Makhno army and of numerous attempts of the Bolsheviki to trap and kill Nestor. That failing, the Bolsheviki had murdered his brother and had exterminated her own family, including her father and brother. She praised the revolutionary devotion, the heroism, and endurance of the Povstancy in the face of the greatest difficulties, and she entertained us with the legends the peasant had woven about the personality of Makhno. Thus, for instance, there grew up among the country folk the belief that Makhno was invulnerable because he had never been wounded during all the years of warfare, in spite of his practice of always personally leading every charge. She was a good conversationalist, and her tragic story was relieved by bright touches of humour. She told many anecdotes about the exploits of Makhno. Once, he had caused a wedding to be celebrated in a village occupied by the enemy. It was a gala affair, everybody attending. While the people were making merry on the marketplace, and the soldiers were succumbing to the temptation of drink, Makhno's men surrounded the village and easily routed the superior forces stationed there. Having taken the town, it was always Makhno's practice to compel the rich peasants, the kulaki, to give up their surplus wealth, which was then divided among the poor, Makhno keeping a share for his army. Then he would call a meeting of the villagers, address them on the purposes of the Povstancy movement, and distribute his literature. Late into the night, the young woman related the story of Makhno and Makhnovщina. Her voice, held low because of the danger of the situation, was rich and mellow. her eyes shore with the intensity of emotion. Nestor wants you to tell the comrades of America and Europe, she concluded, that he's one of them, an anarchist, whose aim is to defend the revolution against all enemies. He is trying to direct the innate rebellious spirit of the Ukrainian peasant into organised anarchist channels. He feels that he cannot accomplish it himself without the aid of the anarchists of Russia. He himself is entirely occupied with military matters, and he therefore has invited his comrades throughout the country to take charge of the educational work. His ultimate plan is to take possession of a small territory in Ukraine, and there establish a free commune. Meanwhile, he is determined to fight every reactionary force. Makhno was very anxious to confer personally with Alexander Berkman and myself, and he proposed the following plan. He would arrange to take any small town or village between Kiev and Kharkiv, where our car might happen to be. It would be carried out without use of any violence, the place being captured by surprise. The stratagem would have the appearance of our having been taken prisoners, and protection would be guaranteed to the other members of the expedition. After our conference, we would be given safe conduct to our car. It would, at the same time, ensure us against the Bolsheviki, for the whole scheme would be carried out in a military manner, similar to a regular Makhno raid. The plan promised a very interesting adventure, and we were anxious for an opportunity to meet Makhno personally, yet we could not expose the other members of the expedition to the risk involved in such an undertaking. We decided not to avail ourselves of the offer, hoping that another occasion might present itself to meet the Povstancy leader. Makhno's wife had been a country school teacher. She possessed considerable information and was intensely interested in all cultural problems. She piled me with questions about American women, whether they had really become emancipated and enjoyed equal rights. The young woman had been with Makhno and his army for several years, but she could not reconcile herself to the primitive attitude of her people in regard to women. The Ukrainian woman, she said, was considered an object of sex and motherhood only. Nestor himself was no exception in this matter. Was it different in America? Did the American woman believe in free motherhood? And was she familiar with the subject of birth control? It was astonishing to hear such questions from a peasant girl. I thought it most remarkable that a woman born and reared so far from the scene of women's struggle for emancipation should yet be so alive to its problems. I spoke to the girl of the activities of the advanced women of America, of their achievements, and of the work yet to be done for women's emancipation. I mentioned some of the literature dealing with these subjects. She listened eagerly. I must get hold of something to help me with our peasant women. They are just beasts of burden, she said. Early the next morning, we saw her safely out of the house. The same day, while visiting the anarchist club, I witnessed a peculiar sight. The club had recently been reopened after having been raided by the Cheka. The local anarchists met in the club rooms for study and lectures. Anarchist literature was also to be had there. While conversing with some friends, I noticed a group of prisoners passing on the street below. Just as they neared the anarchist headquarters, several of them looked up, having evidently noticed a large sign over the club rooms. Suddenly, they straightened up, took off their caps, bowed, and then passed on. I turned to my friends. Those peasants are probably Makhnovtsi, they said. The anarchist headquarters are sacred precincts to them. How exceptional the Russian soul, I thought, wondering whether a group of American workers or farmers could be so imbued with an ideal as to express it in the simple and significant way the Makhnovtsi did. To the Russian, his belief is indeed an inspiration. Our stay in Kiev was rich in varied experiences and impressions. It was a strenuous time, during which we met people of different social strata and gathered much valuable information and material. We closed our visit with a short trip on the river Dnieper to view some of the old monasteries and cathedrals, among them the celebrated Sofievsky and Vladimir, imposing edifices which remained intact during all the revolutionary changes, even their inner life continuing as before. In one of the monasteries, we enjoyed the hospitality of the sisters who treated us to the real Russian tea, black bread and honey. They lived as if nothing had happened in Russia since 1914. It was as if they had passed the last few years outside of the world. The monks still continued to show to the curious the sacred caves of the Vladimir Cathedral and the places where the saints had been walled in, their ossified bodies now on exhibition. Visitors were daily taken through the vaults, the accompanying priests pointing out the cells of the celebrated martyrs and reciting the biographies of the most important of the Holy Family. Some of the stories related were wonderful beyond all human credence, breathing holy superstition with every pore. The Red Army soldiers in our group looked rather dubious at the fantastic tales of the priests. Evidently, the revolution had influenced their religious spirit and developed a skeptical attitude towards miracle workers.